The first sign of trouble wasn't the 400 warriors who would surround his home at dawn. It was the sound of a child trying to die at his well. Elias Thorne heard it as a scratch in the silence. A faint whimper carried on the wind that scoured his barren plot of land. He'd bought the ranch to be forgotten, a place where memories could be baked to dust under the unblinking eye of the sun. For 2 years, it had worked. The world had shrunk to the creak of his porch swing, the groan of the pump handle, and the hollow echo in the rooms where his wife's laughter used to live. But this sound, this tiny, ragged plea, was a trespass. It was the sound of a life snagged on the thorns of his solitude, and he hated it for that. Elias lowered the dusty Bible he'd been reading without comprehension and stepped onto the porch. The heat was a physical weight. Out past the withered corn stalks, by the stone-ringed well he'd dug with his own hands, a small shape was curled. A child, no older than 7 or 8, her deerskin dress torn, and her black hair matted with grime. She was native, from a tribe that kept to the hills, a people he knew only as shadows and whispers. Her lips were cracked and blue, her chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate spasms. She had crawled here for water and found she hadn't the strength to work the pump. Elias felt a cold, familiar dread creep up his spine. It was the same helplessness he'd felt watching the light fade from his Sarah's eyes, the same uselessness that had become the foundation of his new life. He could turn around, go back inside, let the plains claim what they were always trying to claim. It would be easy, it would be consistent. But as he stood there, frozen by the ghosts of his past, the child made another sound, a soft, resigned sigh, as if giving up. And in that whisper of surrender, Elias heard an order. He walked toward the well, his boots kicking up clouds of amber dust, each step a reluctant rebellion against the quiet grave he had built for himself. He worked the pump handle, the irons squealing in protest. Water, cool and dark, gushed into the stone basin. He scooped it into a tin cup, the same cup Sarah used to use for her garden, and knelt beside the girl. She flinched, her eyes opening just a slit. They were black, deep, and filled with a terror that went beyond thirst. He didn't speak. Words were useless things, clumsy tools for a delicate job. He simply held the cup to her lips. She hesitated, her gaze fixed on his face, searching for the monster she'd been taught was there. He held steady, his hand not trembling, though his heart hammered against his ribs. Finally, instinct won. She drank, not with vigor, but with the slow, painful desperation of a fire being coaxed back from embers. She drank until the cup was empty, then her head lolled back, her small body surrendering to exhaustion. Elias looked at the vast, empty horizon, then back at the child in his arms. He had given her water. It was a simple act, a single drop of mercy in an ocean of indifference. He had no way of knowing it was also a declaration of war. He lifted her, her weight next to nothing, and carried her inside his silent house, closing the door on the world that was about to come for him. The girl lay on the cot in the corner, wrapped in one of Sarah's old quilts. For hours, she did not move, her breathing shallow but steady. Elias sat in his chair across the room, a shotgun resting across his lap, watching her. He was a caretaker again, a role he had failed at so profoundly it felt like a blasphemy to attempt it once more. The house was thick with silence, but it was a different kind now. It was the silence of a held breath, not an empty lung. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a footstep. Every creak of the floorboards was a whisper. He found himself cataloging his meager defenses. A dozen shells for the shotgun, half a box for the pistol, the heavy bar for the door. Against what? A ghost? A memory? or the very real possibility that someone would come looking for her. He told himself he was being foolish, that she was merely lost. But a chief's daughter, he could see the intricate beadwork on her worn moccasins, did not simply get lost. He got up and stoked the fire, the low light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The shadows looked like accusers. They flickered over the girl's face, and for a heart-stopping moment, she looked like his own daughter, the one they never had, the one Sarah had wept for in the dark. He felt a tremor in his hands and gripped the shotgun tighter, anchoring himself to the cold, hard present. Later, the girl awoke. She didn't cry out. She simply sat up, the quilt pooling around her waist, and watched him with those dark, unreadable eyes. He felt like a specimen under glass, every flaw, every regret laid bare. He stood and walked to the stove, his movements stiff. He poured a little broth from the pot he'd made for himself into a bowl. He set it on the floor, a careful distance from her cot, and slid it toward her with the toe of his boot. An offering to a wild thing. She watched the bowl, then looked back at him. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a profound, ancient weariness. He returned to his chair, the space between them charged with a fragile, unspoken negotiation. She eventually reached for the bowl, her small hands cupping it as she sipped the warm liquid. He could hear the soft sounds of her swallowing, a small engine of life restarting. When she was done, she didn't slide the bowl back. She held it in her lap, a shield or a trophy. He didn't know what to say. "What's your name?" felt intrusive. "Are you all right?" was a stupid question, so he said nothing. They sat in the dim, firelit room, a broken man and a lost child, two castaways on the same barren shore, waiting for the tide to turn. The hours bled into one another until the first hint of gray began to soften the edges of the window. The girl had fallen back asleep. Elias felt a sliver of hope. Maybe no one was coming. Maybe he could take her to the reservation boundary at sunrise, leave her where she could be found. Maybe this nightmare could end as quietly as it began. He must have dozed off, his chin on his chest, the shotgun heavy on his knees. What woke him was not a sound, but a change in the light. A sudden dimming. The pale gray of dawn had been blotted out. He lifted his head, his neck stiff, and looked toward the window. His blood went cold. The world outside was gone. In its place was a wall of men, a forest of painted faces, stoic and terrible, sitting astride their horses. They were utterly still, utterly silent. Feathers fluttered in the morning breeze. The sun glinted off lance tips and rifle barrels. He couldn't count them. 100, 2, more. They stretched from the edge of his withered cornfield to the low rise of the western ridge, a living, breathing crescent of vengeance aimed at the heart of his home. They didn't shout. They didn't move. They just watched. Their collective gaze, a physical force that pressed in on the thin wooden walls of the cabin. This was not a search party. This was an army. He had seen death before, had felt its cold breath on his neck. But this was different. This was judgment. He slowly rose from his chair, his movements fluid and silent, and peered through a crack in the shutters. 400, he estimated, maybe more. A nation had come to his door. And in the center of them all, on a magnificent black stallion, sat a man whose face was a mask of grief and fury. A chief, the girl's father. The promise of the hook had been kept. Dawn had arrived, and with it, hell. The chief, a man who wore his authority like a second skin, dismounted. He walked forward alone, each step measured and deliberate, his feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He stopped 20 yards from the porch, close enough for Elias to see the lines of sorrow carved around his eyes, but far enough to remain an avatar of the power behind him. He raised a hand, not in peace, but to command the silence. He spoke, his voice deep and resonant, carrying across the clearing in his native tongue. Elias didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. It was in the unyielding set of his jaw, the fire in his eyes. This was an indictment, a sentence. You have taken what is mine. You are a thief and a ghost. You will pay with your life. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken threats. The warriors behind him shifted as one, the sound of leather and horseflesh a low growl. Elias felt the floorboards beneath his feet vibrate with their presence. He was a bug in a jar, and the lid was being screwed tight. What would you do when every truth you could offer would sound like a lie? When your only witness is a terrified child, and your judges have already decided your guilt? His mind, once a storm of panic, went unnaturally calm. The kind of calm that comes when you've run out of options. He could make a stand. Die fighting. It was a good death, a clean death, better than the slow, wasting one he'd been living. But then he glanced at the cot. The girl was awake again, her eyes wide, staring at the door. She wasn't looking at him, she was listening to the voice of her father. And in her gaze, he saw not terror, but a flicker of something else. A dawning awareness. A choice. He remembered a day, years ago, when the spring rains had been relentless. The creek behind their first home had swollen, turning from a gentle stream into a raging brown torrent. He and Sarah had stood on the bank, watching the water chew away at the earth, pulling trees and stones into its maw. "It's got no mercy, has it?" he'd said. Sarah had slipped her hand into his. "It's not about mercy, Eli. It's just water. It only knows how to move forward." He hadn't understood her then, but he did now. The men outside were like that water. They weren't evil. They were a force of nature, a father's love and a people's fear, and they only knew how to move forward. Trying to stop them with bullets would be like trying to stop a flood with a shovel. The only way through was not to fight the current, but to find a different path. His gaze fell on the tin cup still sitting by the cot, an object so small, so insignificant, and yet it was the only truth he had. He thought of Sarah's garden, of the life she had coaxed from this same unforgiving soil. He had let it all die. He had let himself die with it. But yesterday, he had chosen to pour water. He had chosen life. He wouldn't dishonor that choice now with a pointless, violent end. He put the shotgun down, leaning it against the wall. The gesture felt monumental, like laying down a part of himself. He walked to the door, his hand hovering over the iron latch. He would not cower. He would face the flood. The chief spoke again, the words sharper this time, a demand. A few of the warriors on the flank raised their rifles. The movement a ripple of impatience. The time for waiting was over. Elias knew what he had to do. He had to show them the girl. He had to pray they would see her weakness, her frailty, and understand. But what if they saw it as a trick? What if the sight of her, alive but captive in his house, was the spark that lit the fuse? His heart was a trapped bird beating against his ribs. He took a deep breath, ready to unbar the door and step into the blinding light of his own end. But before his hand could touch the latch, a small, warm hand touched his. He looked down. The girl was standing beside him, the quilt dragging behind her like a royal train. She hadn't made a sound. She had crossed the room, a ghost in her own right, and now stood beside the man who was both her savior and her jailer. She looked up at him, her dark eyes holding his. There was no fear there anymore. Only a strange, fierce resolve. She understood. In the way that children sometimes understand the great, terrible truths of the world better than adults, she understood the shape of the moment. She reached past him, her small fingers wrapping around the cool iron of the latch. She was not strong enough to lift it, but the gesture was enough. It was an answer. It was her choice. With a strength that seemed impossible for her small frame, the girl pushed against the heavy wooden door. Elias, his mind reeling, helped her, and together they swung it open. A collective gasp went through the assembled warriors. The morning sun flooded the dim cabin, silhouetting the man and the child in the doorway. There she was, Little Bird, daughter of Black Kettle, alive. For a long moment no one moved. The world held its breath. The warriors, who had been ready for battle, for blood and righteous fury, were faced with a sight that broke the simple logic of vengeance. A small, frail girl, standing not behind her captor, but beside him. Her hand was still resting on his. Black Kettle's face, which had been a mask of stone, cracked. A tremor of disbelief, of hope, of confusion ran through him. Then the girl did something extraordinary. She let go of Elias's hand and took a single step forward, out of the shadow of the cabin and into the full sunlight. She raised a thin arm and pointed. Not at Elias, not with accusation. She pointed to the well, its stone ring glowing in the dawn. Then she brought her hand to her own lips, mimicking the act of drinking. And finally, she turned, and with a slow, deliberate motion, she pointed back at Elias Thorne. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her simple, silent story was more powerful than any denial, more eloquent than any plea. It was the truth, delivered without language, stripped down to its essential, undeniable core. He gave me water. Black Kettle swung himself onto his horse, the movement fluid and powerful. He rode forward, not with the speed of an attacker, but with the heavy pace of a man approaching a sacred site. He stopped just before the porch, his shadow falling over his daughter. He slid from the saddle and knelt before her, his great frame folding until he was at her level. He touched her face, his rough fingers tracing the line of her cheek, as if confirming she was real, not a spirit sent to mock his grief. He spoke to her in soft, guttural tones, words of love and relief that Elias could feel in his chest, even if he could not understand them. The girl, Little Bird, answered him in a small voice, her strength finally failing her. She leaned into her father's embrace, and he lifted her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, which, of course, she was. For a long moment, the two of them were the only people on earth. The 400 warriors watched, their faces no longer masks of war, but of men. Fathers, brothers, sons. They lowered their weapons, the quiet clicks of hammers being eased down rippling through the ranks. The siege was over. The flood had been turned. Black Kettle rose, his daughter cradled against his chest. He turned his gaze to Elias, who still stood in the doorway, a ghost in his own home. There was no anger in the chief's eyes, not anymore. There was something far more complex, a piercing, solemn understanding. A look that acknowledged a debt that could never be spoken of. A shared moment of terror and grace between two worlds that were never meant to touch. The chief turned without a word and carried his daughter back toward his people. The warriors parted for him like a river around a stone. He mounted his black stallion and settled his daughter in front of him, her small head resting against his chest. Before he gave the signal to leave, he paused. He reached to the side of his head and untied a single, perfect eagle feather from his hair. He held it out, not to Elias, but to one of his warriors, who dismounted, took the feather, and walked to the edge of the porch. He did not look at Elias. He simply laid the feather on the top step, a silent offering left on an altar. Then he retreated. Black Kettle gave a sharp command, and the entire army turned as one. They moved away, not with the furious speed of their arrival, but with a slow, dignified procession, melting back into the hills from which they came. They flowed over the landscape, a river of men returning to its source, leaving behind nothing but hoofprints in the dust and a profound, ringing silence. Elias stood in his doorway for a long time, watching until the last rider had disappeared over the horizon. The sun was higher now, its warmth beginning to touch his face. He felt hollow. But it was a clean hollowness, not the ragged, aching void he had lived with for 2 years. It was the quiet emptiness of a space that has been swept clean, ready for something new. He bent down and picked up the eagle feather. It was light as air, but felt heavier than his shotgun. It was not a gift of friendship. It was a marker, a sign of a boundary crossed and respected, a receipt for a debt paid in water and courage. He walked back inside the cabin. The room was the same. The cot was empty, the quilt folded neatly at its foot. The bowl he had given the girl was gone. She must have taken it. The air still smelled faintly of wood smoke and broth, but everything was different. The silence that returned was not the oppressive weight of grief, but the gentle quiet of peace. He walked to the window and looked out at his land, his dead corn stalks, his dusty yard, his solitary well. It was still a harsh place, an unforgiving place, but it was no longer a tomb. It was just land, his land. He thought of Sarah, and for the first time, the memory didn't bring a stab of pain. It brought a dull, bittersweet ache, the memory of a wound that had finally begun to scar over. He placed the eagle feather on the mantelpiece, right next to the faded photograph of his wife. The two objects, from worlds apart, seemed to belong together. They were monuments to the two women who had, in their own ways, saved him. As he stood there, a strange sound made him turn. A soft tapping against the window pane. He looked outside. A single dark drop of rain had hit the glass, then another, and another. The sky, which had been a merciless, cloudless blue for months, was darkening. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The rain was coming. A slow, steady, cleansing rain, falling on the thirsty ground. Elias Thorne smiled, a real smile, the first in years. He opened the door, stepped out onto his porch, and lifted his face to the sky, letting the water wash over him.